Okay, good afternoon to Maastricht University, to Maastricht. My name is Jos Lemming. I'm the Dean of the School of Business and Economics, and I'm chairing this academic session. And during this academic session, Pauline from Beusekom, Thoolen, will try to defend her thesis. Her thesis, her dissertation, is titled Supply Chain Response to Food Safety Incidents. And I would like to ask you to present your dissertation in the coming 15 minutes. Okay. And there's a choice whether you do it in Dutch or in English. Huh? I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, I will do it in English. That's great.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Pro-Rector. So, dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the opposition, dear supervisors, and dear family and friends. It's so great to see you all here and see so many familiar faces here today. I also want to welcome the people joining us online today, as there are also people are looking online and to follow this session as well. Today actually marks the end of a period of research. But even though I hope that I ended today, that the impact of my work will extend far beyond today. I've conducted research focusing on the logistic decision-making elements in the response to food safety incidents. As food safety incidents are inevitable for the food industry, as the common cold in daily life, it's really necessary to focus on these incidents and to having an adequate response to them, as it is essence for all of us, because we are all food consumers sitting here today, so we're all part of that food supply chain. But how often then do those food safety incidents actually happen? On average, about 2 to 3 times a week. So that's quite a lot, at least from my perspective. The World Health Organization actually indicates that yearly approximately 420,000 people yearly worldwide die due to unsafe food. Almost 1 in 10 people fall ill, and approximately 33 million healthy lives are yearly lost due to unsafe food. Yet there is no worldwide legislation applicable how to respond to those food safety incidents, which makes those responses to those incidents rather ambiguous. Recently, you might have heard about recall. A colleague of mine had them still in their closet. Thank you, Kelly. The Ferrero recall. The Ferrero recall was actually announced because in those chocolate eggs there were cases of salmonella. And initially, it was only recalled for a best due date until October the 7th, but recently they recalled all their products. So that actually means they extended it over time, because they got new information. Can you imagine actually what kind of reputational damage or costs are involved if you have to recall all those chocolate eggs? Because you want to ensure that all our kids, and even we as adults, don't eat those eggs anymore. And all the actions that relate to the physical flow and also the information flow to recall those products, they are all part of the logistic response of food safety incidents. As food safety incidents are perceived rather unique as an incident, it's really challenging to respond in an adequate way, and that's what we actually try to explore in our research. And to give you a little bit more insight on the complexity of the decision-making elements, we have kind of a little bit of a background story for you that we actually heard throughout our research periods from a Dutch large international producer, where they explained the following picture. The lady actually explaining this to us said, imagine yourself, it's almost Christmas Eve. Everyone is hurrying home, want to dress up nice, get food in there for the table, and the office building is emptying rapidly because it's Friday evening just before Christmas Eve. She even goes to the coffee machine and she drinks her 5th cup of coffee today, just because she has to work until 5 p.m. Then today, some strange complaints had come in from customers who actually said that an unexpected orange color in the food was seen that they had bought. Of course, she followed procedure and the protocols and got information from the factory where the products were actually produced. This afternoon, they told her of the production factory that last week, in the labeling of the tins, they might have made a mistake. There were different pallets of different products next to each other, and they labeled it with a wrong label, so the tin with the wrong label. Okay, it's still a good product, but the problem actually here was that on the wrong label products, there was an allergen included. And the allergen was of a relatively high extent, which makes it a high risk because of people might fall ill due to the high levels of allergens. So what now? It's almost Christmas Eve. You're still in the office together with your head of office, but all people who normally have to decide, normally you bring up an incident team, they all went home or even went on holiday. So what do? This is a little bit of a background to give you an idea what kind of challenges in a logistic response that you have to think about and have to incorporate. As it's legally mandatory to trace it within a time frame of 4 hours within the food, you have to trace all your products, not even in the Netherlands only, but worldwide. So you have to know where are the product eggs and where are they located. Are they still here in DCs in the Netherlands, or are they in Australia or in Brazil? You have to trace that. So you have to take into account many aspects for a logistic response, because you can block them in a warehouse, you can remove them from the shelves, you can have many various actions. But realize the complexity if not only actors in the Netherlands are involved. Realize what it takes to communicate on a short notice with people worldwide that might be involved. And you have then to share the relevant data in that supply chain. So who then is actually involved in that food supply chain? This is just a generic picture of a food supply chain. And you see on the left-hand side, you see the agricultural or the livestock feed. That is the input for the food processors, the manufacturers. Then it goes via the transport companies to the DCs, to the warehouses, for the distribution and the storage. And then it goes to the retailer in general, for example, your Albert Heijn or the Jumbo on the corner of your at home. And finally, the final consumer. We wanted to understand if something went wrong in that supply chain, how do you then respond? But to understand that response, we wanted to explore the different perspectives in that food supply chain. So not only the producer's food perspective, but also from the other perspectives in that supply chain. That's why we identified 5 different positions in the supply chain. And the positions you see on the left-hand side as a producer, where you add value to the product. Then you have the logistics service provider, who just transports from A to B. Then you have the wholesale retailer as position, which actually does the storage and the sales. That's their main focus. And then the branch organizations are representative for the consumers. And on top, because of course food also has to do a lot with legislation, we included the Food Safety Authority. In Dutch, it's called NVWA. So these are the 5 positions that we actually used as a starting point. So we don't talk about individual actors, we talk about those 5 positions in our research. So what did we actually do? I can imagine that for some of you it must have been surprising to be here and ask yourself, so what we actually did, we collected data over 6 different research periods, varying from 2010 to 2020, and you see here it varies between the focus groups and the interviews. We had 2 focus groups and 38 one-to-one interviews. And its main challenging was actually to let the people open up, because you can imagine you don't want to have a headline in the newspaper tomorrow that Unilever said this goes wrong in the food sector or in our response. So it felt really sensitive to talk to those people. So prolonged engagement was something we really focused on. Based on the data we collected, we came up with this result at FIST. These are the 5 phases, response phases. If a food safety incident happens, then it usually goes through these 5 phases. On the left-hand side, you see the food safety incident, so that includes the notification that there might be some concerns about a product. Then it goes via the ex ante, which includes all the proactive aspects, procedures, tools that companies have. Then it goes through the assessment phase, because you have to assess what kind of risks might be incorporated. And that can be health risks, but also political and business risks. And then you have the actual response. That's the ex post part. So that's the reactive part of the response. So removing the products, blocking the products in the warehouses. And after everything is finalized, you have the lessons learned. And that is already, of course, an input for organizational learning. On top of that, we better want to understand what kind of decisions they're actually making in those response phases. So we actually explored in all the focus groups and the interviews, what kind of decisions do these companies actually make in those phases? And what emerged from the data is that you see that coordination, collaboration, communication, and competence actually emerged as 4 C's, actually, as critical decision-making elements. And what you see here is that competence is actually the human factor in the decision-making, and that's also something that we added compared to what we found in the literature study. And you have to be aware, the biggest challenge in the food supply chain is we actually have a notification today. We have to respond within 4 hours, so the time frame is pressing on us. And then you might only have 50% of the data available, but you still have to make decisions. And that you might come back to those decisions and might extend, like Ferrero also did, they also extended their recall because they got new information. What we also found is that the accessibility of the information, you can imagine if we have to share all of us information to be here in time, we have to have the right communication tools or information systems. And information, the accessibility of information was perceived as a hygiene factor, actually, to be able to make an adequate logistic response in that food supply chain. So, working towards the conclusion and implications, what we actually did is we actually integrated theory of logistics, supply chain management, but also food safety theory. And we actually looked primarily at the decision-making elements there, taking the perceptions of the different views of the positions there. We added the organizational learning, and we also focused a lot in the thesis on information sharing and how to collect information, how to share it properly, to actually create and enhance an effective logistic response. And I think the thing that was stressed most is that in the near future, more intense collaboration between the different actors in the supply chain is necessary to ensure healthy food, and if something happens, to respond adequately. What is it done for the food managers in particular, in practice? What does it mean? The model actually provides a systematic way to go through the decisions that they have to make to be prepared, because each incident is unique, and as it's unique, how do you prepare them properly for that? Because you still have to decide and make decisions on the point. So we present them a way to go systematically through the model and the decisions to be prepared the best they can, actually. So what we actually want to show you here, we don't want the logistic response being like this, but ideally, we want it like this. And with that, I finalize my presentation, and I give the word back to you, dear Prorector.
So before I will open the discussion, I would like to introduce the promoter, Professor Vos, and the 2 co-promoters, Dr. De Boer and Dr. Jansen, at the other side of this stage. Then I would like to open the discussion and give the floor to the first opponent, Professor Maar. Professor Maar is Professor of Innovation Marketing at this university.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Pauline, first of all, congratulations for submitting and now standing here and publicly defend your dissertation. You started a topic some time ago, which has been relevant, and congratulations because it's even more relevant now. I think that is good also. I think you can be very proud also of all of your achievement, and congratulations also to your supervisors. I think it's not only the work or the research achievement, but you also over the time developed your research, your education career, but also very important, I think, and I know that, is also you manage to balance it with your private life. I think that is very important, and that is also, having worked with you together, what I have to appreciate a lot is that you're always positive. You always look for opportunities for students, for research, for practice, and all in this combination at the same time. And I think that makes you such a fit with the marketing and supply chain management department. My role is not only to compliment you as an academic, but of course also to have some questions. Typically when having dissertations in our domain, nowadays it's a lot has to do with technologies. Mm-hmm. And or maybe at least this is when I'm invited to be part of an assessment. Having said that, digital technologies seem to play a very small part in your dissertation. And I actually checked also and searched for digital and technology, and it was really about 10 times only mentioned in 180 pages. So my question is, could you reflect on the role of technology in that field, particularly for food safety? Or more specifically, is how can technologies such as blockchain, IoT, robotics help with achieving some of your information quality dimensions, such as the intrinsic or the accessibility data information quality dimension? And maybe technology can also help you with dealing with some of the trade-offs. You mentioned some of the elements like understandability of data and completeness. There might be a trade-off, and maybe technology can help there. So I'm looking forward to your reflection on technology about food safety.
Okay. Dear high esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and also your interesting question. Indeed, looking back, we didn't use the word technology indeed that much, but implicitly we refer to it because coming back to the role of technology for sharing information is of highest importance. So what you see already, and that's what we also stressed, I think, already in the part of information technology, is that in 2004, Jacques van der Vos already published his findings that to be able to externally integrate it and the supply chain to collaborate a lot with other members, you have to be able to share information, have to have accessible information. And how do you do that? I think technology is a prerequisite to do that. At least it makes it a little bit easier. And I think that even nowadays we saw that nothing has changed. And although the technology has changed over time, but I think what we actually saw is coming back that internally the technology improvements were seen within the companies because they stress far more over time on the external challenges in the supply chain. So my personal interpretation of that is that they internally aligned their information sharing and the technology is better. So internally they might use better technology to share that information, but for the external sharing in the supply chain, to create that external integration, it's still rather challenging for them. And so for me, there is no one technology that could be inserted and applied in the food, but what you see is there is a need to having more an alignment there, similar to feed. Feed, it's similar, but in food we don't have that legislation yet. So for me, it plays a really high important role, technology, to create that external integration. That's also what we said, that an accessibility is the hygiene factor to create that. And accessibility is technology, because that means the information systems, that's the availability of the information, that's one of the subdimensions. So does that answer a bit your question?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Then I would like to continue with our first guest this afternoon, Professor De Leeuw from Wageningen University, and he's a professor of operations, research and logistics.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Dear Pauline, would you mind to ask one of your paranymphs to read out proposition number 6?
Of course. Ooh, excuse me. number 6, yeah. You can hear better the microphone.
Proposition 6.
Okay.
If universities would accept more external PhD candidates, more robust, longitudinal research would be done.
Thank you very much. And the obvious question that follows, of course, is can you explain?
Oh, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this nice question, the opportunity to respond on my propositions. Yes, I would love to respond because what I see, but it's also from a personal perspective, of course. I have some dear friends here also joining us today who also did their PhD candidacy as an external candidate, and you see then balancing your personal life with so your family life with doing research and also having a job. That's a rather balancing, so it's usually on a tightrope. So what you see then, it usually extends a little bit over the years, more than the regular internal PhD candidate at the university where there is a regular period of 4 years. So what could be the advantage of it is that we much more focus on over the years collecting data and also understanding and doing the interpretations. And it's just like a nice bottle of wine. When it lasts longer, you think about it. And sometimes even when I'm on vacation, and that counts also for our friends, we discuss things and then it just... We just understood and we got new links and we were challenged. And I think we had the time to think about it really well. And that might be an advantage, but also might be a disadvantage. But in my personal perception, it would be a good thing for a university to be aware that external PhD candidates could actually extend the focus on doing longitudinal studies much more.
Okay, yeah, I agree on the wine. The only problem is that it increases creativity, but it has problems with the productivity every now and then.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
You talk about longitudinal research, and that it allows you to do longitudinal research. So it doesn't surprise you that I'm going to ask my next question about that, most likely.
Of course.
What I don't hear you talk in your explanation of Proposition 6, and that's also a general question, is what is longitudinal about this? Because taking longer to discuss a subject is great, and that advances knowledge, but that's not yet longitudinal. So why longitudinal? And maybe you can apply that to your research as well. So what is that part of make longitudinal?
The part of making it longitudinal is actually that we actually did repetitive measurements over time, and we had cohorts. We had more the longitudinal panel design methods, so that then you have the cohorts, the focus, the units of analysis, which is the supply chain positions in my perspective. And what we do is actually we have a representation of those supply chain positions over time, and we repetitively measured how they actually perceive the logistic response and also the critical decision-making elements. And what we tried to do is we did a cross-analysis, but we also wanted to incorporate new insights, and that made it rather challenging, though, also in our research design and the protocols, because it appeared to be rather a new thing, and we will also prefer to publish on this, because we actually also saw that the new insights adding on top of the cross-repetitive analysis added a lot for us, because we created new insights, and by doing that, a better understanding of what is happening in that logistic response, because it's of a context that's rather unique and it's still explorative. So, yeah, for me, that's a longitudinal perspective on that.
Yeah, so and I fully agree. It's a very nice feature of your work. And if you look at, for example, medical sciences, it's fairly common there already. There you follow, for example, patients for quite some time. So in that type of research, you fix one thing that you actually follow. What is it that you fix in your research and follow? Or is that not necessary, maybe?
No, at first I think we wanted to have to explore it and a better understanding, because what we wanted to fix is to ensure to enhance that efficiency of the effectiveness of the logistic response. But we didn't know what kind of response phases there actually were involved, or what were the critical decision-making elements. So we first needed to get more insight in that, and after that we actually saw much more that we deepened out the views of the positions as well, because then we saw that reputation has a different meaning, similar as cost. The involved costs are rather equivocal for a different perception for the producer than for the retailer. And that makes it really important to understand if we have to make an alignment, and we have to decide today, and we have a logistic response to food safety, and so we have to be aware that you might have a different perspective than I have in the supply chain, and to be aware of that is the first step to improve and enhance that effectiveness.
Yes, so if Mr. Rector allows me to have one last follow-up question on this. But shouldn't then your unit of analysis be the food incident, the food safety incident, rather than the logistics response? Because you are actually looking at the response, how people respond to that, but you're analyzing the incident.
Can I respond to, okay, okay. Now, I don't agree. For me, the unit of analysis is more towards the supply chain position, because we didn't, unfortunately, that would be the best thing to follow a food safety incident, for example, for Ferrero, from the moment the notification comes till it's finalized, to sit there and to see what kind of communication is there and what's going well and wrong. But unfortunately, as a researcher, we aren't able to do that. And
but you had years. You had 13 years, right? So.
Oh, but I think it's a fair question, and we even discussed it with some of the actors that we have a prolonged engagement with. That if something happens, that we were involved, but at that point nothing happened, and then we were waiting and waiting. So that could also happen, of course, and of course it's a good thing for them. But it was it was not that good for me. But so we decided, what can we do to still better understand the logistic response from that supply chain perspective? So not the food incident itself, but more from that perspective to better understand what decisions have to be made.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Then I would like to continue with giving the floor to Professor Venema, Professor of Management and Organization of the Netherlands Defense Academy.
Thank you, Rector. Dear candidate, I really enjoyed reading your thesis, and to me the phenomenon was a bit new and a bit concerning in a way. I do buy Kinder eggs for my daughter, so next time I will eat the first half myself to make sure it's safe, but hopefully they fixed it following your insights. We're also working on this performance-based contracting project, and you did a massive review study on capabilities literature. So if you would make a linkage between that work and the thesis itself, where the phenomenon is a international time press project. The moment the incident happens, it's time press, international, which is interesting. My PhD was about offshore IT projects, with not so much of a time pressure, but still the international dimension. So if you look at this phenomenon and you make a linkage to your expertise in capability literature, what sort of capabilities would you prioritize for companies to sort of invest in to improve their ability to respond?
Okay, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. That's really interesting. I haven't thought about that yet, but a performance-based contracting, that means actually that you based on the performance that you deliver, that it's getting paid, so not on the traditional way of doing the transactional way of business. Yeah, I think the capabilities that we found is, if I say that correctly, is you have the design phase on the left-hand side, if I remember correctly, and then you also have the contract phase, the collaboration, and also coordination. And I think looking now, making the link, I think that the capabilities that we found in collaboration, so extending and focusing on the long-term relationships, those capabilities also might apply for the food. because if we want to have a prolonged engagement and a long-term relationship, because in performance-based, we prefer to, at least that's what we actually said in the project, you need to have contracts for at least 4 to 5 years or even longer. So that means a long-term relationship. That usually also applies to the food. They usually also might not be 4 to 5 years at least, but they prefer to have longer-term relationships. So those capabilities might actually also apply there, and for coordination as well, because it was also about transparency there. It was sharing data. How do you share data? How the accessibility, the technology part, Professor Maar just asked about. So I think the capabilities there also link, but. Then you also have the contract execution, because in the performance base you usually have, I think, let's say 4 to 5 partners involved there, a few suppliers, and for example the defense organization. And in the food we are working, I think a general food supply chain might actually have 50 to 60 different actors worldwide. So with the extension of the number of people, of the actors involved, that's quite different, I think. So there might be different capabilities on that part. So the contract execution part, I don't think that applies to the food, but of course for the organizational learning part, it does. Because then it's the feedback loop, what we also said, and we definitely recommend an active debate within academics to focus much more on the organizational learning and the feedback loop. And that's what we also said in performance-based. If you want to learn over time and you adapt, then you might improve yourself even within the contract term. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Oudekerken, Professor of Customer-Centric Service Science at this university.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Pauline, first of all, congratulations on this very interesting dissertation, also extended to your supervisory team. You recently joined our beautiful marketing and supply chain management team. And I mainly identify with the marketing part of it. You mainly identify with the supply chain part of it, but we also have a collective that has different research traditions. And the first thing that came to my mind when listening to you, but that's a question that we discussed during the reception, is when you said, well, then you do research and in addition you have a job. And I always thought doing research was my job, but I'm happy to explore that, in more detail. In the past over 25 years, I always thought that the world was marketing. Everything we do is about experiences and satisfaction and services, and that was my lens. But I got to change that perspective since 2020, when the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden the whole world seems to be about supply chains, about face masks that are short. You're talking about food safety. Since February, we are in the very unlikely event of facing a war in Europe. And my question relates to this geopolitical situation that we are in now. And I wonder, to what extent would the framework you propose on food safety also be applicable to food availability? If you look at the shortage of sunflower oil, for instance, would the same framework apply, or by reflecting upon your own findings, would you suggest any changes if you would not focus on food safety, but on the availability of food, or the lack thereof, as a result of the geopolitical situation? I'm looking forward to your reflection.
Okay, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and interesting question. I think that we have to make a distinction that it's similar as in a defense organization. You have an initial deployment phase normally, where you set up a response or an operation, and you have the sustainment phase in a military operation, for example. And if we're looking about food availability, I don't see it as an incident like the food safety incident itself. So you might, I don't know, do you perceive it as an incident, the availability, or
I would encourage you to perceive it as an incident,
Okay.
because if we look at the very specific situation now of the shortage of sunflowers, sunflower oil in supermarkets, it is an incident created by all kind of geopolitical decisions that have been taken or caused. So if you would treat it as an incident, what would be then the similarities or differences in the framework you propose?
If I would perceive it as an incident, I think that the phases, I would call it differently, but I wouldn't call it response phase. But you still have the notification, so you actually have concerns first, that there might some shortages in the market, for example. Then I think you go to the ex ante phase. What happens if we have a shortage, for example, because this is not the first time we have a shortage because of only the war, this aspect, but also to other aspects, there might be a shortage of specific products or raw materials in the market. So the food industry is a bit aware of that, so they have some resilience in that. So in the ex ante, they have their procedures and tools, and they have their knowledge how to deal with that. Then you have the assessment phase, because you still have to assess how big is this problem, and what kind of impact does it have. Because you can imagine the impact if the oil is not there. If we cannot bake our fries, that wouldn't be that big of a problem. But for all the restaurants in the Netherlands or in Western Europe, if they are not supplied anymore, then it becomes a bigger problem, and overall it becomes bigger and bigger. So we have to be aware what is actually the impact, not only for the health impact, but also for the business and also the political impact of having a shortage of, for example, you see that now in the US as well, for the children, the nutrition, for the food nutrition for the kids from age...
Formula.
The formulas. And they also have to deal with that shortage. So, and how do you deal then with that? You still have to respond to that, so you still have a response phase then. But in the response phase, I think it's not only about the long-term relationships there anymore. I think then it gets also to the more informal and to the short-term relationships. So I think cooperation will become much more important there, because we need to be aware to change our and be much more flexible in our relationships with the companies who we actually want to work with, to ensure that the shortage is minimized, for example. And then you have your lessons learned, but that's afterwards. But still, you still need to share a lot of data. You still need to be aware, but only the period it extends. Normally, a food safety incident, on average, it takes from notification to finalizing, it takes about 3 weeks to 4 weeks maximum. Then it's already a long term. So in this shortage, we already see that the war started a few months ago, and we don't know for sure how long it will extend. So it might be a year, it might be only a month, and we have to be aware of how we're going to deal with that, even in the grocery stores, but also for the restaurants, because if we cannot consume it at home, we might choose something else. But the restaurants might be much more reliant to getting actually that oil, to baking their fries and to offer it to you as a final consumer. So I think that the response phases are similar, only the time difference in the time that extends per period is different, and the focus is different there on the critical decision elements.
So playing devil's advocate, what you're saying is the supply chains already have a lot of resilience on how to deal with food availability. They know how to handle these shortages. The phases are almost the same if we talk about food safety, only the time span is slightly different. So actually we don't need your thesis because we already had the knowledge on availability of
That's a
food.
good question. But what you still see is that I think that was also one thing that struck me at first in literature. Most of the companies are good in one critical decision element. So they're good in collaborating or making sure that the coordination aspects are well done. They're usually not on all 4 elements are really on a high extent. They are really involved in that supply chain. So they can still improve. And our ideal situation is that even in the shortage, that you can respond in such a way that you can actually proactively tell your consumers, next month it will be available, but for the next coming 4 weeks, you won't be able to go to the stores and buy it. But providing that information is already relevant, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the opposition will be continued by Dr. Quintens. He is at the marketing department of this university.
Dear candidate, dear Pauline, also my congratulations for your dissertation and this important step in your academic career. My question relates to the 4 C's. In the introduction of your thesis, you mentioned that there is no full insight into logistic decision-making in case of an incident. Your approach to solve this issue has been to use the traditional management concept of the 4 C's. The 4 elements that you clearly link to logistics and supply chain management. The idea behind the 4 C's is a general one, right? So it's a general managerial idea, and it is also applicable to other situations and other business fields, such as marketing and sales and even finance. Now, your results say there is also a 5th one, namely competence. I have 2 questions related to this one. The first one is, what makes supply chain management so different that a new one had to be added to the 4 existing C's? And should you also expand the existing 4 C's with a 5th one in other domains, such as marketing or finance? And the second question related to that one is, you based the development of your 5th C on a relatively limited data collection compared to the vast amount of data that is available on the 4 C's in other domains. With the slightly different answers from your respondents, how can you guarantee that you did not end up with a 5th C called C4 control or C4 centralization? What makes the competence so specific in the case of supply chain management?
Great, dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your questions. Let me first go to the first part. Why adding competence? I think over time, but that's also a personal perception. I come from Eindhoven University of Technology, fully trained as a positivistic researcher, and I think that was primarily what logistics and supply chain management research, I think for a long time, was mainly focused on. And you see over time that we became much more aware, because even initially, for us as a research team, we were not aware that much about those competence aspects, or those human aspects in making those decisions. But then all food supply chain actors involved stress the essence of that human aspect in the decision making, because we can still say, well, you need to share information and you need to have good contracts and everything, but if the data is not available within the time frame, what do you do then? Then it all comes back to your experience to making the right decisions. So for me personally, it was also an opening. It was, I think, early in the research periods, we already added competence, the human factor. But for me personally, it was really important to really fully understand why those decisions are often made not based on formal procedures or stipulated procedures, but also a lot on informal procedures and cultural norms. So, and that's really important to understand also in logistics and supply chain management. So I think that that's something, an active debate in that. I would like to stimulate that as well, even after today. And then going back to the next part, the data collection. Your question was, how could we actually, based on the data collection that we have, whether that's sufficient to say something about this element, right? Well, that's the part we called it explorative longitudinal qualitative research, because we had those cohorts. We actually, the units of observation, we actually made sure that at least on average there were twice participating in the research overall. And I think especially for the producers and the wholesale retailers position, they were 3 to 4 times involved in the research. So we could also, over a longer period, we could actually say something valuable and see how they actually, whether they change or not, their perspectives on competence or not. And what you see even nowadays, because we are still working with some student master thesis from the University of Maastricht, and one of the students came back last week and he said to me, well, the interviewee who also participated in my research said, Well, they still don't know, and they still have no clue what they're doing, and we still have to decide based on what we think it's good, how it feels today. And then I told them, yeah, that's the component aspect, which is, it's really important to also put that on paper, because we have to deal with that. That's the real life. And I think that's an added value for the active discussion, to stimulate that for logistics and supply chain theory. And not only about the primarily original positivistic approaches in there. So that would be my personal preference. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My neighbor, the secretary of this committee, pointed out to me that I made a mistake in your affiliation. It's the Department of Marketing and Supply Chain Management, Dr. Quintens. Yes. Okay, then I would like to give the floor to again to Professor De Leeuw for the second round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rector. I would like to exchange some views with you on what is a food safety incident. Let me start with an example. I have two children, a boy and a girl. One is 15, the other one is 11. A few years old, we were driving in a car back from some faraway trip. Children started to moan. What do? You see the big M, you go to the big M, you eat McDonald's. Well, parents may think about that, what they like, but children like it. Yeah. The very same evening, both my kids fell ill because of the chicken that they had eaten. We gave a call to restaurant. Oh, we don't know. Would you consider that a food safety incident? Well, at least I did. But
Can I respond?
Yeah, please.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
The phone, and thank you. Well, this is a good discussion. Well, the thing is, I'm not sure if I can. Personally, I wouldn't say that would be a food safety incident, but there are concerns there, and we don't know, of course, for sure that it was the chicken. That's an assumption in this case, and it's not up to me to decide whether or not that's food safety. But I think you stressed really a good point that at the end, I think one of the main findings that we have is that even within the food industry, if you would ask here, if we have about 50, if they were all food producers or food, at least actors in the food supply chain, they wouldn't even agree on what is a food safety incident, because the definition of it is rather vague. And that's also of a concern. That's what we also put in chapter in the conclusion chapter, in the reflection, because it's rather vague, it remains vague. And what you see is one of the things, and if you allow me to elaborate on it, we had the Friday afternoon recall was mentioned. And at first, I still remembered going with a co-supervisor to some companies, and they mentioned the Friday afternoon recall. And I thought, well, the Friday afternoon recall. Statistically, I understood that that's not possible, that there are more on Friday afternoon, there are more recalls than throughout the other days in the week. But they said, for sure it's true, Paulina. And I said, well, then explain to me, why is a Friday afternoon recall, why does it happen so often? And then they start explaining. On Wednesday, there is a notification, there are some concerns. But the company might think, well, this is just an incident. The kids might have felt not that well already, so it might have been something else, might have been the ice cream earlier that day. So they might wave it a little bit aside and they just keep it there, but they just hope that they don't have to respond yet. But then over time, it's Wednesday afternoon, it's early Thursday morning, they come back in the morning at 8 a.m. and they hear about more concerns. And then they know they have to do something. And then they have to react. But they still are not aware whether it's the severeness of the incident. And then they try to collect data. And before it's Friday morning, they feel, oh my God, it's almost weekend. It's almost Friday afternoon. Everyone leaves on the Friday between 3 and 5 on a general basis. So we have to drop it in the supply chain, because if it's going to be Saturday morning, I'm going to be the unlucky one, and I'm going to work in the week. I don't want to do that, so I'll just put it with the Food Safety Authority, and just put it in the supply chain on Friday around 1 or 2 p.m. This is the problem. Just solve it, because they don't want to be involved in the weekend, over the weekend on the topic. But the concerns are that the other members, for example, we had a lot of retailers involved, and they said, well, then there is a notification from the producer at 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon, and then we have to respond. And for us, it's also a weekend. The weekend is coming.
But you talk about recalls. Shouldn't your thesis therefore be focused on food safety recalls instead? Because that's where the logistics really start, you know? Then we start picking up stuff and transport stuff, etc.
Can I respond? That's a good question. But recalls is just a small part of the food safety incidents, because I think from our perception, what we heard, I think only 10 to 20% of the food safety incident recalls products. So that means that products actually are returned in the food supply chain. Most of the time, the products are actually destroyed in the warehouses or removed from the shelves and just destroyed in the stores, because you don't want to have that return flows, because the costs are so enormous, the return flow.
But that's a recall as well, right? It's an internal recall.
It's also, but now we're getting into the semantics of what is a recall, of course. But for me, the recall involves a part of a return flow. And if the return flow is not incorporated, then we just said that the food safety incident can be much more than just only the return flows.
Great to continue this during drinks. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Venema.
Dear candidate, so my second and final question is about this sort of tension, so to say, between, on the one hand, a normative, positivist view on decision making, almost like an ideal, and this sort of messy reality. You include a lot of quotes where people say it's messy, fragmented, lack of information, etc. So, is there any way to sort of reflect on these two almost like paradigms? Because we can say, well, we want the sort of normative ideal, but it's not happening. So, what's next?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the question. I think it starts with a normative approach, I think, first within companies and also doing research. But over time, you extend your insights, and that's what we try to do, at least. So I think those normative approaches, where you have the thesis, the collaboration, cooperation, communication, and coordination, those are and communication, of course, they are of a high importance, and to make that alignment well. But we wanted to look beyond that because we saw some struggles there. And we see that, for example, in Ferrero's case as well, you recall something, and then it was really a recall, and then they extended it over time. So they made a wrong decision. You might not fully agree whether it's a wrong decision, but at that time it was the best decision that they had to make. But based on the insights or based on the experience that they have, they could make actually. So over time, I think we actually better understood that the starting point is the normative, I think, approach. That's what we also use from the literature study. And that's how I also been trained as initially for my bachelor and master program. But getting more aware of all the decisions that have to be made, we have to be aware that the active debate on that soft side, on those experiences and the knowledge that we need, what kind of staff do we actually need to make those decisions, is very interesting and valid to actually have that discussion, because it might actually have a huge impact in those decisions that they have to be made.
Okay, thank you.
Then I would like to invite Professor Maar for posing a question.
Thank you very much. When discussing the assessment also with Bart of the PhD, I was very much intrigued that you write a monograph as opposed to a paper-based dissertation, which is more common, right? I thought also, how would this, also when reading it now, how was the process differently for you than it would be for other PhD students that would have certain projects that are finalized? So my question might be a bit unusual, here, but it relates indeed to the format of your dissertation. Ultimately, a dissertation should contribute to the academic discourse, so it's about a critical, analytical communication with a high rigor, advancing scientific knowledge, but also society at large. Mm-hmm. So my question is, could you reflect from your perspective, and of course you only wrote a dissertation as a monograph, right? I'm aware of that. Could you think if such an approach, such a monograph, is more or less suited to contribute to the academic discourse than a paper-based dissertation? I'm looking forward to your thoughts and your reflection.
Well, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this interesting perspective. I have to think about that. Well, there is quite a difference on some perspective, but even on some perspective it doesn't. So I think similar to the regular PhDs, I had to learn and I had to do research and to be engaged in research. What does it mean, qualitative research? What are the quality aspects of it? And so that's kind of similar. But I think the PhD is at least what I see here in Maastricht. They have the projects per year or per year and a half, and they finalize it by an article. The added value of that is that they publish. That's something that is really an added value for them. But the disadvantage is it takes them so much time. So and well, that's my personal perspective. Sorry, but if I hear them going through the timeline, then I think I had the opportunity to collect much more data than they actually have the opportunity. I had the opportunity to create a prolonged engagement with all the actors where they don't have that time, because I know from some studies here in Maastricht that they also focus, for example, on recalls, and they don't go to the industry themselves. They do it on secondary, for example. That's a choice. But the implicit reason also for that choice is because you don't have the time to find those and involve those actors, because that takes time, because I have to ask around and I have to get familiar with the people, and that takes a lot of time, and a normal PhD student doesn't have that time because he or she is just focusing on that contribution. And I think we actually had the opportunity to actually creating that prolonged engagement, and are still having the advantage of it nowadays, because we still have students from Maastricht now doing their master theses, and they still go to the same actors, and they still have interviews there, and we still get to know and still call them on a regular basis to hear how they actually are involved. So I think that is the main advantage of doing as an external PhD candidate, not in 4 years, but a little bit longer over time, we're doing my research. So I think that's the main difference, but there shouldn't be any difference in the contributions on the scientific part or society at large. I don't think there should be. So, but it's a different focus on how they put it on paper or how they publish it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partly. I mean, I think we will discuss that further, I think. But I do think that it is a deliverable, right, an article. Yeah. In that sense, it is easier to make your contribution or to add to the discourse, because somebody then sees it very publicly, rather than say, I work on it over a longer period of time, and then it might be more difficult for the people to access all the knowledge that you have to have collected. So I think in terms of accessibility and contributing to the discourse, it might be easier to use that paper-based approach, but I do think we can also publish, and I hope you will actually, also in the interest of the department, that you will publish also this longitudinal research. I think that would be, and I think it's highly wanted, such longitudinal approaches. I think that is what Professor Leloup said also. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Oudekerken.
Dear candidate, as an associate dean, I take pride in the impact that we create as a school. And I think especially your research has a huge potential of creating impact. So I read your impact chapter with interest and curiosity, and you promised that there will be advices to policymakers, but I couldn't find them explicitly. So could you please summarize the main implications of your findings for policymakers to me?
Okay, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question. I think this mainly relates to the Food Safety Authority policymakers, I think at first, because they actually are representatives for at least in the Netherlands, it's the NVWA, it's the Food Safety Authority Enforcement Authority. And we had a lot of discussions with them because they were also involved, and they're still nowadays involved. And what they see is actually that they perceive it also very normative. And so this discussion is really interesting because I also had that discussion with them, that it's not a 0 and 1, it's not binary. Sometimes there's a gray zone, and how to deal with that. And that's always a question also for them, because there is a tight rope which you have to balance on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Time for defending your thesis has passed at the moment. The degree committee will now withdraw and discuss the quality of your thesis and the defense we just heard. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes. In the meantime, let's take a closer look at Maastricht University's renowned teaching method, problem-based learning. Once the pro-rector reconvenes the session, we'll tune in and continue the live stream.
Problem-based learning, or PBL. What does that mean exactly? 3 of my fellow students and I will show you around. Every week, we analyze a different case or issue together. We discuss the case and everyone can contribute different perspectives to the group discussion. If we get stuck, our tutor helps us out and suggests what we could do next. I prefer going to the library to prepare. Here, I can focus and I have quick access to books or journals that help me understand the case. Today, I can also train my stitching skills in the Skills Lab, where you can immediately put into practice what you've learned. After a day like this, I like going to the gym to clear my head and get ready for the next day.
At UM, you meet people from all around the world. Hello guys. Some of them are doing their exchange semester here, and they often say that PBL helps them learn and retain things very easily. I can understand why. It's a very active way of learning because you have to bring your own perspective to real-life cases. You have a lot of freedom to manage your time, your studies, your hobbies, and your work. Of course, that also means a lot of responsibility. Right now, for example, I'm arranging my exchange semester in Madrid. How cool is that? In this group session, we're the managers who have to allocate the resources of a real company. This is how we put into practice what we learned this morning. Studying here means being proactive and learning to plan well. Prioritizing and performing well under stress are great skills that help you develop as a person. But now, it's time to grab a coffee at the Student Service Center.
Right now, we're at the Brightlands Camelot campus. Here we can apply knowledge from lectures and tutorials in a practical setting. This helps us understand what we have learned and further develop our lab skills. Today, we're determining the amounts of cholesterol in various products. What I really like is the project periods at the end of each semester, where we complete a full research project that includes planning, collecting data, analyzing, and presenting the findings. That way we learn how research works and we're able to see what it's like to be a real scientist. After practicals, I have to write a lab report that also helps me process everything I have learned today. UM has a lot of learning spaces where you can work on your own or with other students. This evening, I'm meeting my friends for a movie night organized by the MSP Study Association.
If you study law, you have to read quite a lot. Not all information is relevant, so you learn how to easily find the information you need to solve your case. In the afternoon, I have to give a presentation, so I like to practice it with a fellow student. Later today, a lawyer is giving a lecture. This will help us better understand the case we're working on. Speaking in front of a group is quite exciting the first time round, but you get to used to it quickly. And having to present helps you also to adopt knowledge better. What I like the most is that we sometimes get to enter a plea in front of a real judge. These moot courts are really exciting. Now it's time for drinks with friends. Studying is important, but so is relaxing once in a while.
Hi, today we'll talk about sex and gender. Two words which are often used interchangeably in research, but however have separate meanings.
In this video, we'll talk about the difference between sex and gender, why it is important to account for one or the other in research, and how to do it.
Okay, let's start. What is sex and what is gender? Sex is assigned at birth and has mostly to do with physical and physiological features such as having XY chromosomes or having a uterus. While gender relates to your experienced or constructed identity, the way you feel about yourself. It is important to know that for some people the gender identity might not always align with their sex assigned at birth. Concerning sex, there are three options: male, female and intersex. The most common genders are man and woman. A majority identifies as either one of those. But there are many other genders next to man and woman, and sometimes people identify as both, or as neither man nor woman, as they might identify with another gender. Furthermore, people's gender identity can be fluid. This means that the way they identify themselves can change over time. Gender identity can be very personal, and everyone can have their own interpretation of their gender identity.
But why do we need this distinction in research? Sometimes in a study, you want to compare the results of two groups and see if there are any differences that are relevant to know. It is important to ask yourself the question, do you want to know the biological differences or some behavioral differences? For some studies, it is relevant to know the biological differences. For example, symptoms of heart attack can be different for males and females. And for some studies, it is relevant to know the behavioral differences. For example, do the same kind of advertisements work well for people identifying as men or women?
So, how can we more accurately account for this in research? We would like to give you some hands-on tips for how to use the words sex and gender right and to make your research more inclusive. First, if you want to address people in general, you could be more inclusive and use participant or reader. In Dutch, beste deelnemer, lezer.
Second, ask yourself, is it necessary to obtain this type of information? What do I need it for? And how will I use it? Not every study benefits from collecting data on sex or gender, so then you should not include these questions.
Third, if for your study it is relevant to know more about the biological sex, you might ask, which sex was assigned to you at birth? Or in Dutch, welk geslacht is jou toegekend bij je geboorte? Don't forget to include the option of intersex.
Fourth, if you're more interested in behavior, you can ask the open question, what label do you feel best describes your gender? Or in Dutch, welk label beschrijft jouw genderidentiteit het beste? And leave the answer options open.
But note, when asking for someone's identity in closed format, you should always add the answer options not listed namely and I'd rather not say, or in Dutch, niet genoemd namelijk en zeg ik liever niet. It can be a sensitive question for people, since discovering your identity is not always a straightforward process.
We hope to have given you some new information and tips on how to make research more inclusive. This video was brought to you by UM Pride. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
En dit zal ik in het Nederlands doen.
Okay.
De commissie hier aanwezig heeft zich beraden over de kwaliteit van uw proefschrift en de wijze waarop u dat proefschrift heeft verdedigd. Op grond van haar positief oordeel en gelet op de examens die u vroeger heeft afgelegd, heeft zij besloten u het gevraagde doctoraat toe te kennen. De hoogleraar professor Vos is gemachtigd u op de gebruikelijke wijze met deze waardigheid te bekleden. Het woord is aan uw promotor.
Belooft u dat u altijd volgens de beginselen van wetenschappelijke integriteit te werk zult gaan, eerlijk en zorgvuldig, transparant, onafhankelijk en verantwoordelijk? Krachtens de bevoegdheid...
Please use a microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Dat beloof ik.
Oh.
Sorry.
Krachtens de bevoegdheid, ons door de wet toegekend volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik hier bij u, Pauline, Leonarda, Josephine van Beusekom Thoolen, tot dokter te bevorderen en u alle rechten te verlenen die daar volgens wet en gewoonte zijn verbonden. Ter bewijs hiervan overhandig ik u nu de bul, door rector, secretaris en overgeleden van de promotiecommissie ondertekend en met het grootzegel van de universiteit bevestigd. En nu wordt het even tricky. Jawel.
Ja, en we zijn natuurlijk allemaal getuigen geweest van het antwoord van de kandidaat.
Ja.
De laudatio zal worden uitgesproken door professor Vos.
Kijken of ik te horen ben. Waarde dokter van Beusekom, beste Pauline. Allereerst natuurlijk proficiat met het bereiken van deze mijlpaal. Mooi proefschrift over een zeer actueel thema. Vorige week nog in het nieuws, glasscherven in het bier van Heineken. Kinderen van Sander die er last van krijgen. Ja joh, het is overal. En op basis van jouw onderzoek hebben we nu weer veel meer inzicht in de logistieke afhandeling van dit soort recalls in de keten. Over de term kunnen we het nog later over hebben. Voorwaar een complex proces. En daar wil ik het eigenlijk nu niet over hebben. Ik wil het namelijk hebben over het proces van onze samenwerking. Een echt, jawel, longitudinaal onderzoek. Ja. Ik heb dus ook voor de collega's, Robert, ik print mailtjes uit. En ik heb dus een heel logboek bij me. En dat ga ik niet allemaal doornemen. Maar goed, ik weet ook niet of het pragmatisch onderzoek is, pagina 50. Dan kijk ik even naar mijn buurvrouw. Maar het is zeker subjectief, gebaseerd op een rijke set van door mijzelf verzamelde data. De afgelopen dagen was ik met een aantal collega's in Berlijn voor een internationaal congres en daar werd de hikingtocht als een metafoor voor een promotietraject gebruikt. Ik hoop dat die meestal iets korter duren, maar goed, dit terzijde. En voor mensen die mij kennen, zullen het niet verbazen dat ik kies voor een reflectie aan de hand van een paar nummers van mijn muzikale helden, De Dijk. Ja. Ik ga niet zingen voor mijn collega's die daar... Nee, dat ga ik nu. Dat ga ik niet doen. Dat doe ik aan de hand van mijn ervaringen die om 3, voor mij in ieder geval, jouw kenmerkende eigenschappen te beschrijven. En zoals gezegd, ik heb heel veel materiaal, dit is nog niet eens alles. Maar ik ga dit niet integraal doen en ik denk ook dat ik geen quotes... Nee, denk ik niet. Hoewel dat natuurlijk in kwalitatief onderzoek wel gebruikelijk is. En ik snap ook dat u naar de borrel wil. Ja, dus dat snap ik, om de jonge promovenden te weten. Ik ga er dus een aantal bewijsstukken uithalen. Het eerste dijknummer is... Wanhoop niet. Huub zingt, straks wordt het allemaal beter en misschien wel beter dan ooit, dus wanhoop niet, wanhoop nooit. Had ik toen maar meteen naar hem geluisterd, want ik kom daar zo even op terug. Hij had natuurlijk helemaal gelijk. Het kwam helemaal goed. Daarom staan we hier vandaag ook. En die hiking heb ik toch wel, tijdens die hiking heb ik toch wel als promotor mijn momenten van wanhoop gekend. Maar het is goed gekomen. En onze eerste contact, ik weet eigenlijk niet of die er is, Jos van Munt, die heeft eigenlijk aan de basis gestaan van dit onderzoek, een ander onderwerp, 2005. Ik heb bewijs dat ik in 2005 daar al eerste contacten over heb gehad. Maar dat was wel een ander onderwerp. Dat ging over waar collega van Venema het over had, over die militaire logistieke netwerken. Dus dat was iets anders. Dus eigenlijk, bewijsstuk nummer 2, in 2008 ging onze nu jonge dokter naar, en kijk, ik doe ook dit soms, hè, dan bewaar ik die visitekaartjes. Maar ja, dan heb je ook wat. Hè. En toen ging ze ook nog een andere baan, want ja, er gebeurde iets. Samen met Wouter naar Amerika, met 2 kinderen terug naar Nederland. En toen ging ze ook nog een andere baan kiezen. Dus dat had wat gevolgen. We zijn inmiddels in 2008 tijdens onze tocht. Dus er moest ook iets geregeld worden en zo ging dat toen. En een belangrijke mijlpaal kwam in volgens mijn dataset september 2011. Ook daar heb ik bewijs van dat we toen met Wendy aan boord kwamen van Team Pauline. Dus dat was ook een mooi moment, kom ik zo ook nog even terug, want dat heeft nog iets meer tijd nodig. En ze bouwden gestaag, dat heeft u allemaal kunnen zien, of het nou longitudinaal noemen of iets anders, maar ze bouwden gestaag aan haar dataverzameling. En toen gebeurde er iets, toen ontstond er een gat in mijn persoonlijke dataset. In 2016 en 2017 heel weinig waarnemingen eigenlijk. En zelfs een momentje dat we even wat wrijving hadden, dat komt eigenlijk nooit voor. Dus maar dat er even een momentje was dat Pauline iets door wilde duwen. Ik zeg, ik heb tijden niks van je gehoord en nou weer opeens. Maar dat loste zich ook weer op. Ja, dat kwam weer goed. En toen moest deze man zo nodig in 2019 van Tilburg naar Limburg gaan. Ja, toen dacht ik, wanhoop. Gaat niet goed komen. Maar dat is wel gelukt. Dus het is klaar. Dus ik had naar Huub moeten luisteren. Dus ik hoop dat u snapt waarom dit hele verhaal. Ik hoop dat dit wijst op wat deze mevrouw een ontzettend doorzettingsvermogen heeft. En degenen die haar kennen zullen dan ook weten dat dat meestal met een lak, zoiets. Dus inderdaad dan ook nog, dan kun je toch niet boos op blijven. Nee, gaat niet. Dus dat wanhopen ben ik bang toch vooral bij mij, denk ik. Of je hebt dat stiekem gedaan, dat zou kunnen. Tweede nummer, het is een van mijn favorites all time. Ik kan het niet alleen, dat kan niet. Het is jouw proefschrift, maar dat is natuurlijk altijd bij veel de belangrijke dingen in het leven is. Het is een kwestie van samenwerken geweest. Maar eigenlijk dacht ik, maar ik wist niet of dat mocht, eigenlijk dacht ik aan het dijknummer wat een vrouw niet kan doen. Nee, ik niet. Maar er is en ik wist niet of ik dat mocht, maar ik heb het speciaal gevraagd. In het voorwoord zult u de term schrijfvrouwen tegenkomen. Maar ik denk, kan ik dat als man die al die witte vinkjes zo'n beetje aftikt, kan ik dat wel doen? Nou ja, want ze zijn er trots op en terecht. Want dan kom ik inderdaad speciaal bij een van de promotoren uit, bij Wendy. Zonder anderen tekort te doen, is Wendy veel meer geweest in het hele traject dan co-promotor. En dat vind ik ook mooi. Dus nee, niemand kan het alleen. En wat een vrouw niet kan doen, daar staat maar hier, naast mij zit ook een vrouw die een grote bijdrage heeft geleverd. En ja, ik was af en toe jaloers. Inderdaad, ik durf dat gerust toe te geven. Ik mocht natuurlijk niet mee. Onbegrijpelijke redenen. Maar goed, het heeft allemaal wel gelukt. Het is allemaal wel gelukt. En dan, nog een vrouw, wat een vrouw niet kan doen. Ali de Boer. Ander koopman. Heb ik ook bewijsstukken van. Waar heb ik het nou gelaten? Ja, zie je, maak er meteen een zootje van. Hè? Kijk, en nu lees ik niet elke week de Telegraaf. Maar dit kwam ik een paar jaar geleden tegen. Onderzoekers Rauw en de Boer. En ik denk, de boer, ja, dat is die van ons. Dat is die van Campus Venlo. En toen duurde het nog een paar maanden, ik ben namelijk niet versneld. En ik denk, eigenlijk moet ik Ali een keer vragen. Kun jij Team Pauline niet komen versterken? Nou, dat heeft een fantastisch effect gehad. Echt waar, de laatste 2 jaar, je hebt natuurlijk een tijd, heb je een jaar echt, en ben je er vol voor gezeten. Maar ik durf wel te zeggen dat jij een enorme bijdrage hebt geleverd, Ali. Dus daarvoor dank. En inderdaad, jij zult misschien zeggen, ik zie je nou bijna denken van, valt het wel mee. Nee, dat is echt heel substantieel geweest. Waren er dan geen mannen bij betrokken? Ja, daar zitten er ook nog een paar. Hè? Dus de Cruijff zou zeggen, ja, logisch, hè? Die zijn er natuurlijk. En ik, nou ja, Jos Vermunt heb ik al even genoemd, maar ik wil ook even noemen, en eigenlijk weet ik niet, is dat Paul Holmes?
Ja, Paul zit daar.
Nou zie ik eindelijk, want ja, u heeft natuurlijk een enorme bijdrage geleverd. U vindt misschien allemaal, ja toch, dat het er zo mooi uitziet. Ja, het is een groot deel. En ook het binnenwerk, zeg maar het editen van de tekst een belangrijke bijdrage. Ook toen er nog een staartje bij kwam. Dus, nou ja, ik kan het niet alleen. Kortom, wat staat dus een doorzetter? Maar ook een enorme netwerker en verbinder. En dat heeft u denk ik in sommige vragen ook al gehoord. Makkelijk leggen en onderhouden van contacten. En dat is echt een eigenschap om te koesteren. Dat brengt me bij mijn derde dijknummer. Kan ik iets voor je doen? Ik vind een prachtig nummer met een blik, een gebaar, een arm om je heen. Zingt Huub van der Lubbe. En ik denk inderdaad heel erg, zoals ik jou heb leren kennen tijdens onze hike, die een promotie heet, heel erg op jou van toepassing. Dus ik blijf me ook een klein jaar, ik heb daar ook bewijs van, ergens in die puinhoop hier op het bureau. Ongeveer een jaar geleden, precies bijna, kreeg ik een mooi mailtje van Dominique, van onze department head, van ja, het gaat waarschijnlijk bijna op de dag af een jaar geleden. Het gaat waarschijnlijk lukken om inderdaad Pauline in dienst te nemen. En ik denk, maar goed, dat ben ik niet helemaal objectief in, dat geef ik ook toe, subjectief, pragmatisch. Dat is ook de kern van het proefschrift. Nou, ik denk inderdaad dat je al zo ingeburgerd bent, terwijl je nog iets moest afmaken, waar we nu allemaal hier voor zijn, dat er iets met corona speelde. Ja, ik vind dat ongelooflijk. En dat wijst op een eigenschap die inderdaad voor mij betreft heel mooi is, behulpzaamheid. Nou ja, het hielp ook natuurlijk dat ze Limburgs is, dat heeft ook geholpen. Dat heb ik dan weer niet en dat merk je na bijna 3 jaar dan nog steeds. Hè, dus, maar dat helpt. Maar ik denk eigenlijk toch vooral dat iedereen herkent dat hier iemand staat die altijd bereid is om mee te denken, om te helpen, of het nou collega's zijn of studenten. Ja, en dat vind ik echt zo'n mooie eigenschap. Dus daarom ben ik echt super blij dat jij bij ons in het team zit, in het departement zit. En Gabi had het over de impactparagraaf. Jij miste iets, ik miste ook iets. Ik miste dit element. Hè, dus dat had wat mij betreft ook best in mogen staan. Kortom. Ja, u mag naar de woord. Wat mij betreft. Ja, trouwens, ik ben geen voorzitter. De doorzettende, vrolijk netwerkende, behulpzame dokter, Pauline. Nogmaals proficiat. Het was voor mij een eer en een genoegen om deze reis samen met jou te mogen maken en al die andere mensen. En ik ben super blij dat je niet alleen de titel nu hebt, maar dat je ook nog bij ons departement blijft. En dus mijn subjectieve mening, let even op, subjectief, nog veel meer pragmatische ervaring, maar nu eerst de borrel. Dank voor jullie aandacht.
Ja, ik wil me heel graag bij de complimenten aansluiten. Het schrijven van een dissertatie, dat is één. Hè? Dat is schrijven, dat is typen, hè, om het maar even te noemen. Maar het is ook afmaken, hè, de finishing touch. Hè, en ook gegeven de omstandigheden hè, die uw promotor ook zo geschetst heeft, vind ik dat een hele geweldige prestatie. Dus gefeliciteerd, dokter van Beusekom. En ook blij dat u blijft bij Maastricht University. Ook namens het college van bestuur en ook namens het bestuur van de School of Business and Economics. Als u ons de gelegenheid wil geven om naar buiten te gaan voor een fotomoment, ik denk dat dat usance is op dit moment, dan kunnen we daarna aan de borrel. En hierbij sluit ik deze academische zitting.
Maastricht University would like to extend warm congratulations to the PhD candidate and their supervisors on a successful PhD defense. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching.